But so tonight we've got a wonderful panel of awesome thinkers who will each have a different perspective on intersectionality. And so, you know, we know that diversity is the greatest driver of invention. And so the more diverse thoughts we have, thinkers we have, experiences we have, the richer our solutions become. So I'm gonna bring our esteemed panelists up here. And so, you know, I could tell you what they do, because they're all like, you know, they do incredible things. But I think even juicier than what is it that they do is who they are. And so often we're used to, you know, listening to panels, listening to speakers, and it's always, you know, here's Melissa, she is the president of great things, and she has many great things. But how much do we really know about Melissa? Because what we do is different than who we are. And who we are is who shows up to work every day. Who we are is who innovates. Who we are is who connects, who joins, who makes relationships. And so rather than me telling you, you can read it in the program or on the website, I'm going to invite our panelists to come up and to tell you who they are versus what they do. And I'll start. I'm Sandy. I'm a daughter, a sister, a founder, an absolute geek, especially when it comes to leadership. I like to collage, and I love being around people, and this kind of 3D like experience is like making my extroverts so happy. And that's me. So Melissa, if you could come up and have your seat and tell us about you.
Oh, such pressure. Well, good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
Happy to be here. Thank you, Luke and Paul, for the invitation. So I am Melissa. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. I'm a Midwesterner. More specifically, I'm an Ohioan. Even more specifically, I'm a Daytonian. So I'm just a little girl from Dayton. I am a wife. I am a mother. I'm a sister. I'm an awesome auntie. I am a mother in love. And I am not a pet owner. I am a contender for the next American Idol in my car. I know all the words to every song, and I sound fantastic. I can be, I'm a borderline introvert, extrovert. So I say I get paid for being an extrovert, but I'm really an introvert. I can be by myself a lot. And I'm interested in good perspectives. I don't like mean people at all. So happy to be here, looking forward to more juice. Is that enough?
Yeah, that was perfect. Thanks. And now let's meet Chuck. Oh, there you are.
Good evening. Is this thing turned on? I think so. So I'm Chuck Andrews. I am a G9 Papa 3. My master password. I'll change it tomorrow. So G9 is I have 9 grandchildren, and I'm the father of 3 wonderful children. You can call a 53-year-old, a 49-year-old, and 46-year-old children. So we're a very blessed family. My wife of 53 years is with me tonight. I am a former Republican, and I'll confess how that changed. My oldest daughter is an attorney with Sidley, and about, I'm going to say 5 years ago, she said, "Dad, you got to take this test." And the test is go online. It's called Political Compass, and you simply answer every question that you can imagine around variety of things. And it comes back and kind of tells you where you are on a 4-scale quadrant. And I went from being a Republican to being a very liberal Democrat. So that's kind of who I am. I'm also a lifelong Cubs fan and a lifelong Methodist. And you'll hear a little bit more about that later. But those have been inherited in my case, and I think they're inherited in many people's case. And some of where DEI comes from, I think, is actually inherited. So we'll get into that a bit too.
Awesome. Thanks, Chuck. And last but not least, Daniel.
Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Daniel Cervantes. On some days, Daniel Cervantes. A little bit about me. So I would say that I think it's important in the spirit of the conversation we're having today. I am one of 8. Family is deeply rooted in everything that I do. My mom's side of the family is one of 18. My dad's side of the family is one of 13. I wanted 5. My wife said, "With who?" And so, in the spirit of that, I have 2 kids. So, on any given day, I am a social entrepreneur. I'm a family man. I'm a father, husband, sometimes Superman, according to my kids. But ultimately, I live my life based on the audacity of hope. Because throughout life was told that you can never do this, you can never do that. To this day, I'm the only one that pursued education and have realized the doors that opens. And I want my kids to be able to recognize that they themselves can aspire and grow and achieve and do all the different things that sometimes we're told we can't do. So it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. And Holly wishes that she could be here tonight. She had the sniffles and she figured better be safe than sorry, so she didn't want to be in a room full of people. But so we're still, that just means more time for us to talk. And I'll start by asking the panelists some questions, and then we'll open it up for your questions. So it'll be more of a conversation. So think about your questions and don't be shy about asking. All right, here we go. So today's discussion is around the idea of intersectionality. Can each of you share what intersectionality means to you, and how do you gauge your own awareness to it? How do you define intersectionality? You want to go?
Yeah, I think I can go. So the immediate 2 words that come to mind when I think of intersectionality are identity markers. And for me, I look at it as the unique perspectives when you think of all the isms, right, that was talked about earlier, race, age, gender, and how each of us have a unique perspective of how we at some point in our lives have experienced discrimination, oppression. And it's a real thing, right? And so for me, in the line of work that I do, it is why it is core to why I joined the organization. To your point, is that when you break all that down, all of us are looking for that opportunity, and oftentimes, it's just the reality of life that the majority of our ability of doors that are open for us is through who we know and the networks that we are associated with. And it's unfortunate, but where you're born and raised doesn't often afford that network. And so to me, that intersectionality is really a perspective of the unique experiences, right, based on the isms that we experience, oppression and discrimination.
Yeah, thank you. And to build upon that, it is the prism through which we see the world. And I really love the way you set this up in terms of who comes to work, like who people really are. Because there's often this term, this phrase that's tossed around, you know, diverse person, diverse student, diverse customer. And I go, who exactly are you talking about? And then they kind of look at me like, talking about you? And I'm like, well, you can't be, because you don't know enough about me to know how much diversity you think I hold. But if you're calling me, quote, diverse because of the color of my skin, you're sadly mistaken. And chances are, if we had a chance to talk a little bit more, you probably have a little bit more going on than I do. I've never lived in another country. I've never been to Europe. You know, I don't speak another language unless you count profanity, and then I'm bilingual. So this notion of diverse means, you know, people with darker skin is just a shortcoming beyond belief, and frankly, to me, it dehumanizes people, because we all take the census, and there's no box on the census that says check here if you're diverse. It says check here according to how you identify from a gender standpoint, check here around from a socioeconomic, what's your income, check here, you know, how many people are living in the house, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we make a lot of assumptions based on what we see and less about who people really are. So I think the first thing is intersectionality is the prism through which we see the world. That said, we are all complex, layered creatures. And the longer you live, the more complex and layered you're gonna be. So if you just imagine this nice white wall behind us, imagine where none of us are here, and it's just the wall, and you have an opportunity to just project all of your experiences onto this wall. All of us are a part of many different cultures, capital C, cultures. We talked about being Methodist. I was raised Christian Methodist Episcopal. A lot of confusion happening there. But ultimately, I identify as Christian, right? Add Black Christian on top of that. Then I probably have some differences with my, you know, Black Baptist Christians, you know. So all of these cultures we're a part of, and then you add to it wherever you live. Add to that wherever you grew up. I say I'm a Midwesterner, but I saw the hand came up. You're dating a Daytonian too? You know what? Centerville. Okay, we got different cultures, but okay. That's good. That's good. So there's, just put it this way, there's socioeconomic diversity between the two of us. Okay? But these are the cultures that we carry with us. And we don't easily shed them until we make a decision to disengage from some of those cultures. Okay? So you take all of that, bundle it up, and then you want to try and go and work in an office with some other people who are all carrying their own layers of complexity as well. So this notion of wrapping our mind around intersectionality is really, really important, because it should help us to think about who am I missing, or who or what am I ignoring in this conversation, in this situation, what have you. You know, it's about considering other perspectives, being willing to have our perspectives widened and challenged and so forth, that perhaps even gives us yet another culture that we can add to our layer, right? So, you know, I'm a part of the yogi culture. Who knew, right? You probably look at me and say, oh, she's tall. She probably played basketball. Not. Right? So these are the things that we have to challenge, you know, and not assume that the last person I saw that looked like whatever, oh, they're all gonna be the same. You're gonna embarrass yourself.
Excellent, thank you. Chuck, yeah.
So I have a confession. I had no idea what the word intersectionality meant.
Can you use the mic?
I said, I have a confession. I didn't know what the word intersectionality meant. So I looked it up, and this is a diagram that shows, informed me as to what intersectionality might include. So it's race, disability, nationality, gender identity, and sexual orientation. All those things I recognize. I didn't recognize how they met. And I think that's the challenge that we face is to recognize, and I think you did a nice job of talking about how it all comes together and what we have to do to become more aware. So I think the first thing we need to do is start asking the questions and being open.
Yeah, and we got started, so this is good. You know, I think, Melissa, the point that you made is so important too about, you know, it's the filter that we see the world through. So if for our conversation today we think about it framed like this, that intersectionality and culture are the people, the experiences, and the conditions that shaped our worldview. And to your point, when we show up with all the people that we've ever met, the people that have loved us, hate us, hurt us, excited us, and all the experiences, going away to school, or getting married, or having children, or the conditions, the things we had no control over, like growing up in Ohio, and the sports team that you love that is apparently charged up, you know, or being a Cubs fan. And all of these things, these conditions, these experiences, these people, shape the view that we have of the world. And everybody's is unique and different and special. And so what happens when we all come together with different filters is we're going to have conflict. Or somebody has to put their lampshade on and to kind of blend in, right? So tell us this, if the people, the experiences and conditions that shape our worldview create this filter that we see the world through, can you maybe share some of the filters that have been shaped by your career? And how did those filters get built? So, for example, I was a teacher, a school teacher, and we wore bright colors. Teachers wore colors, and like I had a little pencil pin with like little, you know, school things dangling, and you know, you meet a group of people and you're like, well, hello, friends. And then I became a technology founder, and people didn't wear colors. All black. Like black clothes. And as an educator, you know, I'm always trying to find out, what do you know? Like, and how can I bring information and knowledge and information to your feet? Whereas in technology, people are always trying to figure out what you don't know. And so those filters that I had were bumping up against the filters that other people had in the industry. So what do you guys think? How does it show up for you at work, your filters?
I think we need a bartender to come and bring it. Put your phones down. Wow, so much, right? And I was thinking, as you were talking, I was thinking, you know, when I introduced myself, I didn't say that I was a black woman. But I am. And that is a huge filter for me. Because as I have continued to grow in my career, so when I grew up in predominantly black neighborhood, went to a predominantly black school, still to this day, you know, my high school, which I was in a small high school, graduating class of 128, Jefferson Township, 128. And every 2-3 years, we all get together as a school, not just a class for a reunion, but a school. So we had a very tight-knit community We did not have mass transportation, not even buses were going, our way. So it really was, if you couldn't get there by bicycle, you weren't gonna go, So I moved to Chicago. My husband took a job, moved to Chicago in 1996 and went up into Vernon Hills. So the opposite of what I was raised with. And I was in my 30s. I'm like, well, what do I do with this? I got these 2 kids and husband's traveling all over. Like, what do I do with this? Where do I get my hair done? Yeah. That's a big deal, right? That's real. And I can't tell you how many hairdressers I've gone through. But
I had the same problem.
But I had to search for things that were familiar. So that lens is very present for me. And then as I've continued to grow in my career, get into various leadership roles, I am often the only person in the room of color. I'm often the only person in the room who's Black. I'm often the only person in the room who is a combination of any of those. So, it's not from a guarded perspective. I'm also aware that there may be people in the room who have some implicit biases about people like me. And there may be an expectation that I turn my Blackness down, if not off, in order to be accepted in that room as credible and as serious and not an affirmative action hire. A diverse hire, right? That word. And so I feel that every single day. And that's not to say that I don't work for a great organization, because I do, but that is a reality that there are not as many people that I can look around and bump into who have some semblance of who I am, male or female, right? Whereas my counterparts have lots of options. And that's not to say that I can't and don't have relationships with them, because I absolutely do. But there is a piece that, quite frankly, may not get served to the fullest that some of my counterparts are getting served, right? And so my lens often is what's missing. What's missing, who's missing, and where can we find what's missing? Thank you.
I definitely want to piggyback on some of the things, Melissa, that you mentioned. I'll sort of address it in terms of culture, generation, and gender. I'll start with generation. So I think the last couple of years has been interesting for me on a personal level, because we all know what occurred over the last couple of years, right? The dual pandemic, health, and racial equity. And oftentimes there's this perception that, well, okay, we have somebody here who's Latino. Tell us a little bit about kind of what the Latinos are interested in, what they want, et cetera. I'm like, first of all, you have to understand the Latino community is so complex, from Mexican American to Puerto Ricans to Colombians. We are very different. We share a lot of similarities, but we're very different. The other piece behind that is generation. I mean, my dad gets up in the morning, back in the day when there used to be a paper, right? A physical paper. And how he receives his information is going to be different from my generation and other generations. And so that unique perspective, it's hard to just say, oh, let's just do this blanket statement and you kind of know how we need to address or how we recruit more Latinos into the work that we're doing. The other piece is around culture. That's one of the biggest, I think, barriers that on a personal level I've had to overcome over time, which is I was raised a particular way. In our culture, at least how the way my parents raised me was that, you don't speak out loud, you don't speak up. You respect your elders, you kind of put your head down. And in the environment where it's all about, right, getting your creative thoughts and you want to share your perspective and your life experience, it's not that you're being rude, right? But it's the articulation of what you have to say in the right time of when you say it. Again, you're not disrespecting, you're not being rude to anyone, but it's getting over that cultural barrier. And then the last piece that I'll mention is ageism, or gender, as I mentioned earlier. When I started off my career before I entered the nonprofit world, I was in management consulting. And it was heavily dominated. Every environment I was around was dominated by males. And I won't go into details, but some of the conversations that would take place would be very offensive if there were others in the room. And I think for me, not only having a mother that raised 8 kids, but also I see my wife and being in the nonprofit where I get to interact more with a diversity of different perspectives, there's such an appreciation of having that sort of more holistic view. And so I think, you see all these different angles, and it's a reminder of like, it's not a one-size-fits-all perspective, right? But it's complex.
Yeah.
I mean, your question in general is a big question, right?
So in terms of filters, you can easily recognize that why I'm sitting on the panel. I'm the old guy. So I'll take it back to 1961. I was 17 years old, and I got a job as a janitor in an office of the National Cash Register Company, later known as NCR.
In Dayton?
Yeah. In Danville, Illinois. I grew up in Oakwood, Illinois, a town of 525 people. The diversity there is either you were Baptist or you were Methodist. And you were all white. We didn't ever see an African American or black person until we went to high school, and there were like 5 black people in our high school. And that was a small school. I had graduated with classes of like, I think it was 38 people in my class. But I bring up 1961 because when I went to work for NCR as a janitor, I didn't realize I'd be there 15 years. So I went from being a janitor, being a technician, to being a sales guy. And I spent those 15 years that was my life. And when I left in 1976, I realized how different the rest of the world was. There's a filter in the employment you have, that you see the world just through that perspective. And it was quite a shocking process to get into a world where I didn't have to look at the cash register first. I just had a different perspective about life, and it's a filter that I have appreciated since then. And I talked to CEOs today about how long you've been in an organization, and time has a tendency to kind of create a filter in itself. So you must recognize that when someone's been around a long time in a role, they just view the world from that perspective, and it's challenging to get outside of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, wow, thank you. And I think we could go on and on about our filters, and you can too. I'm sure you're thinking about some of the filters that you have that develop throughout your life and how that shapes the way you see the world. So let's talk about the dominant culture, the norms that create filters for everyone. For example, quality over quantity is a dominant norm. That dominant cultures value things that can be measured over things that cannot. And with that example, think about how does that shape our company cultures in terms of what we reward. If we're only rewarding things that we can count and not qualitatively, how does that shape our culture? How does that shape the way we do business? So what are those cultural norms that you all have faced, and how have they impacted you personally in your careers? And just to make the question even more complex, how are things changing in your organization or from your perspective? So cultural norms impacted you personally, and how are things changing?
I'll take a stab.
Okay.
Pray for me. on top of the personal cultural components, I think there's also the culture of individualism versus collectivism.
Mm-hmm.
And those often permeate ethnic cultures as well, right? And so when you think in terms of like, Daniel said he thinks family, shapes a lot, that tends to be a lot of collectivism versus I got mine, you get yours, get out of my way, I, which we hear a lot of. That's individualism, right? So when from a corporate culture perspective, if you spent a lot of time in a culture that valued that individual effort, and, what are you bringing to the table versus integration and collaboration, that's going to be collision, and how things get done could feel very difficult. Even easy things could feel very difficult based on how you've been indoctrinated to get things done. How do I resolve conflicts? Do I go tell Dad? Guess what they said, fix it for me. Or do I say, Chuck, can we talk? Right? And so when you've spent a lot of time in cultures that are open to that, we address conflicts directly, and then you shift to a culture that's like, go tell somebody and they'll handle it for you. And then they'll tell somebody and maybe they'll handle it for you. And then we'll make eye contact and maybe you'll take a step. Okay. So these are the things that if you're gonna be in the culture, these are the things you have to become aware of. Which could interfere with your work product, quite frankly.
Yeah.
Right? Because you're trying to navigate all these things. So that's why the unspoken rules are important to investigate. How do they get things done here? I am no longer in Kansas. Tell me what I need to do differently, because I want to make sure that I am fulfilling my commitment of what I came to do, right? So when I came to Wintrust, this is my third company, third industry leading diversity and inclusion. It's a lot. Went from tech to retail to financial services. And I say this tongue in cheek, to several people internally all the time. I say, only thing I know about banking, it came from Mr. Drysdale. Mr. Drysdale always showed up with either some money or a product, and then you had the quintessential banker martini lunch and golf every Friday. I'm looking for all those things. Why am I sitting here at 6 o'clock at night working on a project with you? So it was a foreign concept to me. So even though, when I interviewed for the job, I said, I could tell we were getting closer to an offer kind of situation. And I'm actually interviewing with the CEO at Waymer, and I said, well, I just want to be clear about something. I know nothing about your industry. I know nothing about the work that you do. I have a bank account, but and I said, does that matter to you? Because I don't want any false impressions here. And he said, no, doesn't matter to me. We don't know what you do either. Sounds like that sounds like very pompous. And so I was like, well, okay then. We got ourselves a deal. And so I literally spent the first year going around and meeting with all of the bank leaders and department heads and things, and I wanted to understand what you do. Before I just go unloading on you what I know, let me understand what you do. Because I'm woefully outnumbered, right? So when it comes to norms, practices, behaviors, these kinds of things, there were experiences that I had in the past. I spent 13 years at a company where I was one of the oldest people in the company. The average age was 28, including leadership.
Oh.
Right? And so, you know, that was when I was at CDW, late 90s. And so I start there with my old buttoned up self, you know, the generational divide is showing up. And then I start to notice, wait, they know how to like have fun. Like, they know how to fit in dinner, the softball game, watching their favorite movies, playing with the dog, walking the kid. They know how to fit all that in and just seem to be happy. I need to figure that out. So I was a boomer with a lot of Xers. So I learned from them, right? They probably didn't know. They taught me as much about just trying to find some kind of balance, right? And what I was able to maybe teach them, right? So, long story short, I always try and make it a point to really understand what is the history of where I'm going. So if I cut you open, what is going to bleed out? If I cut you open at Wintrust, you're going to get blue blood. Right? So if we can agree that none of us knows everything and that we're all willing to learn something, then we can build a better mousetrap and not lose as much sleep.
Yeah. Thank you. I want to talk just a quick second about how important that is of learning the dominant culture, learning the unwritten rules, learning all of the things that kind of make up the company's filter itself. And then all the time that we spend trying to understand the majority culture, the dominant culture, that is becoming a filter too, that learning and that understanding. So if we're all sitting in a meeting and we don't have to decode what the unwritten rules are, or what the unwritten parameters are, we get to be present and experience work. But if we're still trying to decode everything, we're actually not present in the work itself, what we're being paid to do.
I think you can learn a lot about culture from the size of organizations. And I say that because I've been with a number of relatively large companies like NCR I mentioned. I also spent time with Dell, 6 years with Dell. I was with Toshiba, a Japanese firm, and I was with a company that Motorola bought. So I saw some really large organizations, and I also did about a half a dozen startups in my last 75 years. And size makes a difference. In large organizations, cultures get established. In small organizations, they kind of are very fluid. So I think it's good to get out and look at different types of cultures. As I thought through this process, I thought, well, what happens when you really want to change culture? And I'm reading a book now from Wendy Woods called Good Habits and Bad Habits. And they talk about what it takes to change something. And they give the example of smoking. In 1964, the Surgeon General said you shouldn't smoke. And at that time, 40% of the Americans, of U.S. citizens smoked.
Wow.
10 years later, 40% of American citizens smoked. So knowledge didn't work. What worked was when they took vending machines out, when they took the ability when they put notices on the cigarette packages that says it'll kill you, and then when they finally got around to taking the ability to smoke inside buildings away, smoking changed. So knowledge doesn't work. It takes either legislation or a mass effort on the part of the community. And I think we're going to run into that when we start looking at an environment. I think it's going to take a lot more than talk and knowledge. So that's my perspective.
Yeah, thanks, Sean.
Just want to add something on this back end, Sandy, that you were saying about learning. and I'm sure many of us in this room have experienced this or seen it, that there's always this notion of unwritten rules, right? And having to learn how to decode those. I think the last couple of years when we went in and were thrust, many of us, into this virtual environment, it was navigating of, okay, what now, right? What happens to those unwritten rules? And now we have new unwritten rules in the sense of, well, why did Sue turn off their camera and never had him on, right? Do I now need to follow with her? What's happening there? And so what is the proper, quote unquote, etiquette or unwritten rules when you're now in this hybrid environment that, I was talking to Drew earlier, that I don't think, many organizations, many industries, not all, but several industries will not go back, right, to 5 days in person. And so it's sort of recreating what that sort of etiquette looks like. But what I am, optimistic about is that many of our young employees and in general across the board are really challenging the status quo, right? That why do we have to have whatever FaceTime, right? Like, is that really necessary? And what's the notion? What does true collaboration and being in the office look like? And so I think it's an interesting time. And as we've gone out and surveyed, all the employers we work with, they themselves, are figuring it out. Mm-hmm. And I think all this will continue to evolve, and as we see what the next couple of years look like.
Yeah, so right. And that's where the innovation is, right? Again, at the intersection. Think about the backgrounds that we can choose. Those were designed not to have cute backgrounds, but to cover up the mess in our house so that nobody else would see it. It was an act of innovation. So, what about inequality? So how does inequality manifest in the workplace? And how can we create an environment at work where people can really be their authentic selves?
Chuck mentioned that oftentimes change doesn't happen without legislation, and he's absolutely right. One piece of that legislation is, Title VII of the Civil Rights Act.
Yep.
That granted, that frankly made it illegal to discriminate employment based on age, race, gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, etc. So the notion of inequality in the workplace, from my perspective, is less of an issue than inequity in the workplace. Because equity requires that we meet people where they are and engage in conversation with them that allows them to articulate, what do you need? What support do you need to help you be successful? Right? Everybody's not at the same starting line. It's almost like when there's a long distance run in the Olympics, right? They were staggered starts for the longer distance run, and then eventually you get a chance to catch up, and then everybody gets a chance to get in the right lane, and then you just gotta be faster than the other person, right? So imagine always being at a staggered start, and then add to that, I didn't go to the right school, okay? And then add to that, I'm a single mom, I gotta get up out of here at 4:30, so I can't go to your happy hour, right? And then add to that, I actually have a prosthetic leg. And, sometimes your doors don't work, So add to these different things that are also dimensions of diversity and therefore filters and intersectionality that various people have, whether or not you can see them is a different story. None of us looks like our story, by the way, okay? So this notion of inequity. So let's break it down. Inequality is, does everybody have a bathroom? Does everybody have an opportunity to go to the gym? Does everybody have an opportunity to go to the cafeteria? Does everybody have a desk? Does everybody have equipment? Right? Elevator, everybody can get on any elevator they want, whenever they want, right? That's equality. is, how many people are in your leadership development program? And how many of them have been promoted? Is it faster or slower? Is it indexing or under indexing? Is it taking them longer? Are you spending time with them? Who has mentors and who doesn't? These are the elements that add to inequitable outcomes. So people might, like me, watch these things and say, hey, you know, you always want to go to the Cubs game. Have you ever thought maybe allowing some other people to make a choice around what you do as a team? I don't know, take an open air bus ride or something. Get some other perspectives. Guess what? Everybody's not a Cubs or a Sox fan. I had a leader tell me, male leader, tell me, I work very hard not to react every time that there's an invitation to go to a sporting event because I just don't like sports. Learn something every day. You know, I do like sporting events. I can't get one invitation. What's that about? But that's how it shows up. And so therefore there will be people who feel like they have been on the short end of that stick who may never tell you that. And then when he or she or they leave and give you an answer like, I just have a better opportunity. They may not be telling you the truth. They just need to get away from you. I'm serious. Yeah. You know, people don't generally quit their companies, they quit who? Their managers. The people who are impacting them the most every single day. I worked at a company where I kept hearing the manager. I could hear, he had a very loud voice. I could hear him in the next room. He would go to my colleague, he'd spend a lot of time with her. And I was like, he never comes over here. He never comes over here. What's that about? And I just got to the point where I don't need this. You know, I'm not gonna go beg for your attention like I'm some love-struck little girl. I'm not doing that. I'm out, you know? And when I left, he proceeded to tell me, well, you know, you're probably smarter than the people you're going. I'm like, absolutely. You didn't seem to notice. So I'm out. Even if it's not better than this place, I'm not with you. That's all I care about right now. You know? So really understanding, really being attuned to what's the level of engagement like. And when engagement shifts, why is it shifting? Don't just blow it off of, Nancy's having a bad day. Is she? Is it consistent? And if she is having a bad day, ask her if there's anything you can do to help her. Thank you. Yeah. Chuck, wait.
I should say, I think when I think of equality, I think about what's the level playing field mean? Because you very seldom see a level playing field. And that's, again, a matter of size to some small degree. In large organizations, the playing field is drastically unbalanced. So it's how we train people, how we educate people, how we set the right habits for people to actually expand their ability to be competitive. And I think that's a very poorly done job today in most organizations. I do a coaching program now through an organization called Positive Intelligence, and it's about what goes on in our heads that keeps us from doing things or triggers us. And it's the most equal thing I've ever done, because every human being has different triggers that causes them to do things. And I'm so excited about organizations that recognize we need to get to the heart of each person in the organization and get to know them really well and understand what it is that causes them to act one way or another. Today I drove down to Springfield and worked with a group on this topic, and on the way down and on the way back I listened to a audible book. Makes the 6-hour trip a little easier. And the book said, we're asking the wrong question. We shouldn't be asking what's wrong with you. We should be asking what happened to you. And what happened to you says that we're interested in you as a person, what causes you to be where you are today. And organizations start recognizing we have to deal at the human being level, we're going to get to an equity position faster.
Thanks.
Yeah, I think that gets back to one of the earlier comments, to your point, Chuck, that Melissa made about how as we, I won't use the word ageless, I'll use as we become wiser, right? We become much more complex. But what's interesting is that from my observation and sort of vantage point, over the last 12 years talking to a lot of different companies, I've really seen, prior to the pandemic, sort of the dominant theme conversation was around corporate social responsibility. Then the pandemic hits, and then it's a focus on diversity. And what I've seen in, I guess if we're calling it the endemic, has been a shift and a big concentration around equity, right? And one of the things, just to give you a tangible example that, we started to modify and change things, is that we're developing career pathway programs for young adults. And we had a situation, we'll leave the company unnamed, but where a young man, literally went to their direct supervisor in retail and said, "Can I take lunch?" The supervisor says, "Yes." "Okay, cool. Let me go and take lunch." So it wasn't just let me go for half an hour away, but literally, let me go into the fridge, grab lunch. All excited because they were able to have, they didn't have sufficient money in their pocket at that point. They just started working, and they were super excited that the supervisor was willing to give them lunch, take lunch. Now, there wasn't a conversation. That person was fired. Now, we got involved, and how we evolved and changed our program on the career pathway side is that we said, we actually need to create a boot camp and talk to those direct supervisors that are going to engage and be the ones that are supervising these young adults, because the reality is everyone grew up in a different sort of lens, right, and experience. And so take lunch. We tend to use this concept of that's just common sense. No, it's not. What common sense to you is not necessarily common sense to me. It depends on the experiences in which we grew up. And so I think for us, that has evolved from an equity perspective where, now we're trying to level the playing field in the sense of listen, you got to appreciate where they're coming from. Not to say that they give them a freebie or anything like that, but also help the young adults that are going through this program appreciate kind of the stresses and the things that they have to manage as supervisors for that particular retail.
Sure. Wow, what an important story. Can I go get lunch?
Yeah.
Of course. And it's the refrigerator and
It's glowing.
Yeah. I was at IC Stars. I was building curriculum around allyship. How do we become allies? And as you know, technology is very male dominated, and so what I wanted to do was teach how can the men support the women at IC Stars. And so I really looked for curriculum, I couldn't find it. Talked to people, couldn't find it. And so I had to make it myself. And what I came up with was this. At IC Stars, the women will never clean the kitchen. They're not allowed to clean the kitchen. They're not allowed to touch a cup in the sink, nothing. And that we would assign a kitchen man to clean the kitchen in every cohort. And it's funny because the first thing that the guys would do when they get assigned the kitchen man is change it to kitchen manager. They would give themselves a promotion. And people think, well, that's not fair, what about the girls, blah, blah, blah. Well, it is so hard for every woman at IC Stars not to clean the kitchen. That in fact, when we open the cupboard and look for a cup, we always look in to make sure. So part of this is us learning how to trust that we're going to be taken care of in that way. Because we're socialized to set the table for everybody else to eat and to feed ourselves last. And in a technology environment, we can't do that because the starting line is already back here. So how do we as allies make sure that the women that we care so much about or at least have a seat at the table. And so there's the kitchen man. And all of you are welcome to come to IC Stars at any time and mess up the kitchen. All right, so let's do some questions. What do you think? Let's start this conversation. Yes, here we go.
This is going to be a dilly. I'll tell you why. I'm an executive recruiter. I hire talent. There has been a trend over the years, legally, you are not allowed to ask an intern, a student, or anybody who works for me if they have a disability. So I want you to imagine people who come to work at my firm or for companies, they don't know they have an intellectual disability. They might be on the autism spectrum. They get to work and they fail miserably. Why? They can't do the task in the time they are allotted to do it. And they're not intellectually always capable, or they might not even know that they're on the spectrum. And so they are at an extreme disadvantage and they are fired. We need to, and I'd be curious about your impressions because this is becoming an issue that isn't getting much media coverage, but it is there. And there's a huge number of people, predominantly men. There's no media being covered about this issue. And yet, when I hire student interns to work at my firm, I'm not allowed to ask them if they have a disability. Because the student has to be self-motivated to say, oh, I need help, and I'm getting help with student affairs at the university. I can't ask them. Okay. So imagine you're hiring managers and you want to be DEI compliant, and you have candidates who are on the spectrum and will not be able to do the task. What do?
Thanks, Lynn. Anybody want to take this one? Oh, sure, I'll take it. So, you say you work in education?
I'm sorry, what?
You work in education?
No, I'm a recruiter. I hire talent.
Got it. Okay.
And I hire students as interns.
Got it, okay. So, on the application, there could be a question, probably should be a question. Is there anything that you need or anything that would prevent you from being able to perform the duties as assigned? Right? That's one way. Once they come into the organization, you can ask them again. You know, would you self-identify as an individual with disability? I don't need to know what it is, but we do ask them again. And it is a very personal choice, right? They can self-ID or not. Because of our relationship with the federal government is actually not a DEI compliant situation, it's an EEOC compliant situation. And there are actually goals that they tell you you have to shoot for, like 5.5% of your entire workforce should be individuals with disabilities, 6% veterans. They tell you that, right? So we give ample opportunities annually for people to self-identify. We also want to create an environment that really encourages them to ask for what they need. Anyone ask for what you need, right? It's no different than, I need a raise up desk because I have a compacted disc and I gotta stand up every now and again, right? That's an accommodation. So there is this whole practice around reasonable accommodation that is available. And part of that reasonable accommodation could be employment support services. There are employment support coaches out there for individuals. They don't know. The sad part is, you're right, many of them may not have had the resources or the opportunity to be specifically diagnosed as having some of these challenges.
and therefore they've probably gone through life in many different ways and been subjected to it. And so statistically, I'm not sure what the number is, but yes, statistically I am understanding that there are more men that have mental health challenges, more men that have learning disabilities, more men of color that have mental health challenges and learning disabilities. And there's also more men of color who wind up in the penal system because there isn't tolerance for wanting to give them the support and the assistance that they need. So, proficiency tests are always kind of controversial, but perhaps there's one that you can find that kind of works, that's not meant to exclude, but just meant to understand where people are. There's a lot of different services in the area to help people with those learning disabilities and so forth, other disabilities, but they don't always do a great job at preparing them to come into the workplace, which is sad. So we have a difficult time finding that talent ourselves. So it is a tough challenge, but you can ask the question once they are hired.
Once you're hired, you can ask?
It's a self-ID. They can choose not to answer. So it's a yes, no, I choose not to answer. Am I a person? I am a person with a disability. Yes, no, choose not to answer. What you can't ask is, well, what exactly is your disability? And part of that is how comfortable they feel with you. Because there is oftentimes the reason why more protected veterans, people who have donned the uniforms and served for this country, and people who have disabilities say they don't self-identify is because if I do, I get stigmatized. As soon as you find out that I'm not perfect, you put me in a category, which is another reason why I do not like the phrase diverse employee. Put behind glass, break in case of emergency. That emergency is I need to count you for the federal government. Right? We just need, Sandy said it, we just need to see people for the humans that they are. And you too could be donning a disability and not know that you would qualify as an individual with a disability. It's very broad. It's very, very broad, right? But a lot of that is also, frankly, a failure of the education system as well.
Dan, you made a good point around what the opportunity of the pandemic is going to present. I mean, right now there's more jobs than we have people for. So it seems like there's an opportunity here to look at how do we take that whole category of people and both educate them and create legislation around how better to do the hiring job. The book I mentioned earlier about we're asking the wrong question, we should be asking what happened, applies to this as well. And it is, by the way, this is an Oprah book, just so you know. and it's marvelous, but she points out exactly this issue of veterans and disabled people being able to find employment. So I think we're at a point in time where we need to look at every opportunity, every challenge is a major opportunity, particularly around hiring.
Yeah. We've got time for one more question, and here's the question right here.
Thank you, Sandy. So my question is really around quality versus quantity that came up, and there's this whole culture around the numbers versus the story, the reason, the purpose. So I'm questioning, like, with the mix of everything that's happening, like, how do you see that culture? Like, what's the battle? How is it going to be won? Is it going to be quality over quantity or quantity over quality as we continue to look at things in that culture of numbers, results, kill yourself to do it, make us money, versus you're a person, I want you to feel like you have a place you belong, so forth and so on.
It's a both and. Let's be very clear. This conversation about diversity and inclusion in the workplace is an economic
companies are not in business to make us feel good. That's why we get paid. Right? Even though you're like, I love my job, I do it for free. Let's try it one day. It's an economic decision. They're trying to appear better than the competitor, right? The question is, are they sincere? Do they really mean it? So I say both, quantity and quality. I'll tell you in a minute, I don't need a bunch of people of color working in an organization that's not making the organization more money. That's ridiculous, you know? But if having more people of color in the organization helps us to make better decisions, because there's a unique perspective and backgrounds, norms, practices, beliefs, and cultures that they're bringing to the table that we haven't heretofore had access to, that's a different conversation, right? And people, you work, unless you have multiple jobs, and some people do, most of us can only take one company at a time. So that one company gets my attention, right? That one company gets my effort, right? It will behoove that one company to make sure they understand who I am, what do I bring to the table, and tap into what do I know, my background, my perspectives that can help make better decisions overall, versus hire for diversity but develop for sameness. Hire for diversity but develop for sameness. You see that? Yeah. Hire for diversity, but I'm gonna make them the dominant culture, which, by the way, is relative. The dominant culture is whoever, whatever, whomever is in the majority, by count, by quantity, okay? So, oftentimes, we're like, oh yeah, let's, put the nice glossies out, do all this money for recruiting and so forth. Bring these organizations, you probably see it in your work, bring these individuals into their organizations, the individuals eager, ready to go. The organization's like, okay, just sit over there and just be quiet. Because the box got checked.
Yep, exactly.
The box got checked. To which I would say, you probably had a quality resource and a not so quality organization. And a toxic culture will eat a quality resource for lunch. Yeah, great point. And I think even to kind of close this, when we talk about diversity and we talk about inclusion and all these things, there's sort of three levels, right? There's the interpersonal level. How do people show up at work? Are they comfortable in being themselves at work? Do they have an opportunity to feel welcome and included? And then there's the cultural piece, right? The community piece. That's about how do we as a community show up in our organization? What do we stand for? What are our ethics? What are our values? And then, as you heard, several stories about a system. So that's the policies that are made within the organization or within the country that say, this is legal, this is illegal. Like the smoking example, too. It was at a systems level that it changed. And that's what made a difference in conjunction with taking the cigarette machines out of the places. And so it's three layers. And then if we think that it's something we can just solve on the personal layer, we're missing out on a whole lot of opportunity and ultimately change. And so how do all these things kind of fold together? Wow, I told you it would be juicy, right? That was a great conversation. I'm going to thank our awesome panelists for really... we started out by saying who we were instead of what we do. And so now I think we all kind of have an idea of what they do, but that's based on our perception, right? Like, could Melissa be a lawyer at the bank? Or should she? So let's just do a quick round of, so what do you do? Oh, that wasn't in the book, in the material? Seriously, that wasn't in the material? Okay, that's fine. So I'm the Chief Diversity Officer for Wintrust Financial.
I chair a Prestige CEO Roundtable, and I do exit planning with an organization called Value Builder Systems, and I do coaching for positive intelligence.
Well, it's an Oprah.
What's the title of the Oprah book?
You're asking, let's see, you're asking the wrong question. It should be, the question should be, what happened to you? And that's actually the title of the book, What Happened to You.
Is it Oprah approved, you said?
No, it's Oprah herself.
Oh, okay.
Oprah wrote the book.
Oprah wrote the book. She and a University of Chicago psychiatrist that she's worked with for the last 30 years. Spent a lot of time in Africa with helping women, rise up. And it's an outstanding book.
And just Daniel Cervantes, we didn't say this earlier, but I guess Senior Vice President for an organization called Skills for America's Future. And the whole premise behind it is actually what we're talking about today. And that's basically taking workforce, and we know that 80% of jobs are filled by who you know, and that's the premise behind it. By literally being that zip code equalizer, that neighbor to those that aren't necessarily in Lincoln Park and some of these other neighborhoods. So that's what I do.
I want to finish with one comment because I thought it's appropriate. I changed my logo, and I picked a logo that was inspired by a speech that commencement speech, and there are these two fish swimming along, and as they swim down this stream, an old fish swims in the other direction, and the old fish says to the two young fish, "How's the water today, boys?" And the two young fish swim on, and the old fish goes the other way, and pretty soon, as two young fish go down, one of them turns to the other and says, "What the hell's water?" And that's essentially where we are with DEI today, I think. Most people don't know the water we're swimming in.
On that note, thank